Now, a second point is that there's precedent for this sort of voluntary...
Hey, Holding!
Who the heck is that?
Down here, you moron!
What the flippin' stink do you little pests want?
You're full of banana split, Holding. Yeah, anyone can say Jesus was a human sacrifice.
Oh, come on! He was judicially executed in a way that tens of thousands of others were. He wasn't taking part in any sort of religious ritual when he was executed. His death had no communicative function, and he was killed by Roman soldiers, not priests or brokers of any sort of religious covenant. Any anthropologist will tell you that the death of Jesus bore no resemblance whatsoever to what is regarded as a human sacrifice. So how can you say Jesus was a human sacrifice?
Because the Bible says so!
Okay, let's go back to Exegesis 101. Okay, I have to admit I made a mistake on this one, and it's the sort I make fairly often. Basically, I really didn't conceive of anyone being so stupid as to look at the judicial execution undergone by Jesus and say, golly gee, that's a human sacrifice. Never underestimate a Fundy atheist and their ability to screw things up. The appeal these guys make is to verses like these. And typical of Fundy atheists, they'll take these all as stark naked literal in spite of the historic record of the Gospels which show that they're not. In light of that record, all of these passages are at most what could be called simile, something indicating that Jesus' death was in some way like a ritual sacrifice, while not actually being one. The error these Fundy atheists make is what the Semitic scholar James Barr called illegitimate totality transfer. Basically, they assume that just because Jesus' death is in one way compared to a sacrifice, or because the term sacrifice is used of his death, then this means that his death is in every possible way to be defined as a sacrifice. There's no consideration for the use of a tool like simile to transmit some other message about the death of Jesus. Let's figure out exactly what sort of message is being transmitted by these passages. Ephesians uses the language of two different types of offering. One, the burnt offering, and the other, the fruit offering, which was kept and eaten by the priest. Now obviously Jesus wasn't burned on the cross, and he also wasn't eaten by priests. Plus the fruit offering wasn't killed. So the Fundy atheist will have to make the wacko argument that while Paul meant offering literally, everything else about this, he was being metaphorical. Sounds like the sort of excuses a Christian fundamentalist would make. But that won't work anyway. It should be noticed that here also in Ephesians, Paul tells us to be imitators of God and live as Christ did. Not even the Fundy atheists think this means Christians are supposed to offer themselves as human sacrifices. But notice these two passages. Yep, these are two examples of the language of burnt offerings being used to describe something else metaphorically, to refer to something that pleases God. If you take them as literally as the Fundy atheists take Ephesians 5:2, that means we have to kill ourselves on an altar also. Next up, 1 Corinthians 5:7, where Jesus is compared to the Passover. Now by itself, when compared to Ephesians 5:2, this also kills the literal human sacrifice interpretation, because obviously Jesus couldn't have been a literal burnt offering, a literal fruit offering, and a literal Passover offering. Those sacrifices were all done differently, and all served different purposes. And of course, unlike the Passover lamb, Jesus' blood wasn't spread on doorposts, and his body wasn't eaten. And note something else about this passage. Jesus is called our Passover, a word which broadly refers to the whole of the Passover observance. Despite some translations like the RSV, the word lamb isn't actually present in the Greek. Nor is a specific reference to the lamb meant. In context, Paul is addressing a problem in Corinth of a man who is being expelled from the congregation for bad behavior. In verses 6 through 8, Paul uses the metaphor of leaven to show that tolerating bad behavior could tempt others to see how far they could go. Part of the Passover observance was the cleansing out of old leaven. Paul's message to the Corinthians in this light is, as Christians, you're purified by Christ, our Passover, which means you too are unleavened. Then we have all the sacrificial language in the book of Hebrews, especially chapter 9. But even here we have mixed analogies to show that something other than bare literalism is in mind. In Hebrews, Jesus is referred to as both the offering and the high priest, which obviously doesn't reflect any real-world possibility. But here we need to bring in some other passages, which are conceptually tied to the picture also found in Hebrews. Here in 1 John, Jesus is referred to as a propitiation, a term which is used of a sacrifice that turns away divine wrath. It's this picture more than any other that would seem to literally match the idea of Jesus as a human sacrifice. But not so fast. Let's go back a bit to the Old Testament sacrifice to which a comparison is being made. Readers of the Old Testament tend to assume that the sin offerings there are made to God to appease His wrath. But in reality, the sin offerings were for the purification of men, and it was the blood of the sacrificial animal, not its death, that was critical. The key word for atonement means to cover, and the blood of a sin offering is towards sin, to cleanse and cover it, not towards God as an appeasement. So likewise, it is interesting to note that there is no place in the New Testament where it is said that Jesus takes God's wrath upon Himself for our sake, even though this is sometimes assumed by those who adhere to a standard penal substitution model of the atonement. Paul confirms this when he refers to the death of Christ as the mercy seat, which is the place where blood was applied. Of course, he also does refer to Jesus in terms of the sin offering itself, but the contradictory images are merely another demonstration that we're dealing with similes here, not literalism. So bottom line, although sacrifices typically served as propitiations by turning away the wrath of a deity, the propitiation served by the death of Jesus was rather directed towards our purification, not appeasing God, but rather making it so that we were no longer worthy of being objects of His wrath. And so there you have it. As usual, the Fundy Atheists are doing nothing more than reading the text in English and adding their own primitive literalist context to the text. Pretty sad, isn't it? Oh, you want down, you say? Okay. Try to do better next time. Okay, guys?